Good evening. I am Barbara Herman. We would like to welcome you to the biennial Call to History. This is the North Star Museum's of Boy Scouting and Girl Scouting's main fundraiser for this year. Because of COVID, we are still limited to how many can enter the building at one time, be socially distanced, and masked. The theme of this year's event is patterned after the Antiques Roadshow. We will be introducing you to 4 artifacts within the museum and telling interesting stories about them. The 4 artifacts include the following. First, Camp Minnesota, which was a training event for Girl Scout leaders held in the 1920s in northern Minnesota. It was also called Ghost Camp, and you'll learn why from Emily White to expert Bonna Scheer. The 1917 Liberty Bond Medallion, the second story, and its history is presented by Barb Herman to expert Kurt Likely. The third, the story about Mary Eva Johnson, her golden eaglet, and her life in Girl Scouting is presented by Lorna Palm to expert Sandy Craighead. 2 very large Scout memory books belonging to Charles Sumner's presented by Kurt Likely to expert John Andrews will be the last presentation of the 4. Between each of these stories, there will be short commercials featuring the events and programs to be held at the museum this year. The program will end with a closing statement by Dan Stoltz, the CEO of Spire Credit Union. But do not leave then. Just as in the Antiques Roadshow, you will see a few items that did not make the cut. Let us start the show with the story of Camp Minnesota. Enjoy it.
Hello, my name is Emily White, and I contacted you about these items I have from Camp Minnesota. A friend of mine found these very fragile scrapbook, autograph book right here in her grandmother's attic. Her name was Eunice Verrier, and she lived in Newport, Minnesota. And she attended Camp Minnesota in 1928. It has a few pictures and information about her experience on this adventure on North Lake, which is north of Grand Marais, Minnesota. There are also several memories and autographs of other attendees in the book here. I also have a song book over there. It's called Songs of Camp Minnesota, compiled by Marjorie Edgar. I think she had something to do with Camp Minnesota. I've done a little research on Camp Minnesota, but find it very confusing as to where it was and how long the camp was there. I would like to visit this camp this summer. Is it still a Girl Scout camp, or is it owned by someone else? I think it might have been a national camp for Girl Scouts. What can you tell me about Camp Minnesota?
Hi, I'm so happy to meet you. I'm Bonna Scheer, archive volunteer. Wow, North Lake is really up there. It's on the Minnesota-Canadian border. Have you ever been up there?
Well, I've been to Ely and I've been to Grand Marais, but I've never been up in the Boundary Waters. It sounds really interesting, and it sure is up there.
I did a lot of research on Camp Minnesota and North Lake mentioned in the scrapbook. In 1928, I can't imagine driving through the North Woods for 50 miles and then by boat and canoe to get there. And it was all piloted by Mr. Bale of the Minnesota State Forestry Service. This was a quote by Ruth Sampson, who was also up there in 1928. The campers were young, strong, and adventurous, but they weren't alone. They did have men from the Forestry Service nearby who taught them how to sharpen and take care of tools, clear brush, and even pitch a tent. Even their Canadian neighbors were there to help build the camp. This all came to fruition thanks to Marjorie Edgar and her vision of a wilderness training camp in northern Minnesota. Marjorie's first Girl Scout experience started in 1915 when she started the first Girl Scout troop in Minnesota. In 1921, she had an outdoor training camp in Cable, Wisconsin.
You mean it was in Cable, Wisconsin? Wait a minute, was that called Camp Minnesota and it was in Wisconsin?
I'm not sure if it was called Camp Minnesota or not, but that's where she started at a Girl Scout camp there.
I'm glad she brought it home.
Oh, yeah. In 1922 is when the planning started to progress. In January of 1922, she had a chance to speak to First Lady Lou Henry Hoover, Girl Scout National President about starting a wilderness training camp in northern Minnesota in August. It was decided the camp would be on Oliver Island in Burnside Lake by Ely. This is one of Marjorie's first trips to Ely. Mrs. Hoover also attended the National Wilderness Training Camp, later named Camp Minnesota.
Wait a minute. The First Lady was here in Minnesota, and she was up in the Boundary Waters with these people?
I know. Can you imagine the White House to the wilderness? She had to be one strong woman. The camp was officially certified as a Girl Scout National Training School. The attendees came not only from Minnesota, but eastern states and some internationally. They came from England on a steamboat to New York City, and then probably a train to Duluth. And then from there, they got on a smaller steamboat up to Grand Marais. The instructors were not only from the State Forestry Service, but local staff members and national staff from New York City. The University of Minnesota also provided professors from the Forestry Research School and Farm School that gave talks on forest conservation, leadership, and nature. After a week of training, the attendees were able to take a week-long canoe trip led by camp staff.
So we also had our own university farm school, which is what they called it then. They also assisted with this camp.
Yes, yes. Can you imagine the organization of trying to get all these people?
Not 100 years ago.
No. In 1922, the camp started on Burnside Lake and then moved around for a few years to Hungry Jack, East Bearskin, and Poplar Lakes. Then in 1928, it moved to North Lake. They even had a permanent mess hall there just in case of bad weather. Otherwise, they ate all their meals outside. During this time, Marjorie even had time to organize Girl Scout troops in northern Minnesota and learn new songs from the locals. Marjorie had been interested in folk songs since she was 12. During the summer of 1924 on Hungry Jack Lake, Girl Scout leaders learned songs from her and one another. Marjorie decided to choose the best ones to publish the music and lyrics for further leaders' training sessions. The book included 12 songs from diverse ethnic groups that she had collected from previously published songbooks and from individuals who sang songs to her. She loved to teach songs to Girl Scouts. The book I have here is the product of her hard work in 1925.
So Marjorie published this songbook by herself?
Yeah, it's my understanding is that nobody wanted to do it, so she did it herself.
Boy, what a woman.
Yeah. Towards the end of the life of Camp Minnesota, local and Minnesota Scouts came for camping and canoe experiences. We still don't know where the camps were, hence the name Ghost Camp. I'm sure it's out there somewhere with the Voyagers, the Forest Rangers, the Fur Trappers, and the Girl Scouts enjoying the stories and the songs.
So there really isn't a camp to visit?
Nope, sorry, it's more memory than a place.
Interesting. About how long did this camp last?
It's around 10 years or so.
So my understanding from what you're telling me, do we know if this mess hall is still there?
No,
We don't know. It
No.
probably isn't. It looks pretty ramshackle right there.
yeah.
What a wonderful experience for these leaders, and now, of course, for girls, because I know they're still canoeing up in the Boundary Waters. Thank you so much, Bana.
You're welcome. Thank you for coming, and thank you for bringing these. These are fantastic treasures.
Thank you.
North Star Museum offers Merit Badge Workshop Weeks for Scouts. Merit Badge Workshop Weeks in 2021 will be the following: June 14th to 19th, July 12th to 17th, August 9 to 14. Workshop topics to be determined. For information and to register, go to www.nssm.org. Coming up, North Star's Story of Liberty Bonds and Scouting, featuring Barb Herman presenting the Liberty Medallion, Kurt Likely explaining the history of the Liberty Bonds and the medallion.
Barb, this is an amazingly weird, interesting thing. Can you tell me how it ended up at the museum?
Well, the first time this appeared at the museum, it was because the CEO at the Indian Head Council had this thing once a year, the offices need to be cleaned out, and anything that was sort of sitting around got thrown into a dumpster. What I did is once a year I would dumpster dive to get whatever goodies were in there and then take them out to Round Table. Well, this was in there. It was sort of sitting on the bottom because it's really heavy.
Yeah.
And then I retrieved it and gave it to the museum. And then, for some reason, the museum didn't know what to do with it. So it ended up back in a dumpster. And Bob Hanna retrieved it that time. And since then, it's been here. And I just want to know a little bit more about it.
Okay, well, that explains how it got to the museum, and it's a very interesting journey here and back again, and now we will treasure it. The bond drives came about because Wilson had opposed entry into the war when he ran for re-election. Remember, he kept the song about mothers and he kept My Son Out of the War. Now that he's decided the war is there and he's in it, he decides that, okay, we're not going to essentially fund the war through the government, we're going to sell bonds. So the country funds the war, and off they went. And there were 5 bond drives, including one after the war ended. What happens here is the first time they did, Scouts were very interested in being involved. BSA wanted to be involved, and they said, look, we will provide manpower to help sell bonds. And the government decided that what would happen is the Scouts would be the last sales effort. They called them the gleaners, picking up the seeds out of the field after the main harvest. And so the Scouts did that. The problem was a number of regions and councils did not meet their goals. National decided to call them out on it. You didn't make the goal. The Minnesota people were a little uncomfortable with that. So they determined that they were just going to drive a dynamite drive during the second bond drive. And in fact, there was an article that appeared in the Minneapolis Tribune, if I remember right, saying to the world, Boy Scouts of Minnesota challenge all other Boy Scouts in the United States to beat us. We will win, and the winner will get an award from the Treasury Department and the Secretary of Treasury, Mr. McAdoo. So suddenly, here's an interesting beginning of this award. The Boy Scouts in Minnesota succeed, in part because Charles Summers is a good friend of Louis Hill and Louis Hill gives them a check for $100,000 for bonds. And Summers' son takes the check and presents it in a ceremony that noon of that same day, and they're off and running. They did sell the most bonds in the second bond sale as anybody in the nation. They received this plaque, medallion. What's interesting is this hardly appears anyplace in the literature of the historians. In the 1918 annual report for Boy Scouts nationally, there are 8 towns and states that win one of these. I cannot find anyone but this one, and I'm having trouble now, I did 3 years ago, on the internet even. So I think maybe everybody had the same problem. Big, heavy, what do we do with it? Out it went. So I don't know whether we have the only one or not, but it's intriguing. Scouts certainly made a statement in the war by their participation, both of this and recycling and all that kind of stuff. So this is a point where Scouting really attracts national attention, and the poster is a good example of this. This is for the third bond Liberty Loan campaign, the one after the one they get. And this was one of the primary posters that advertised that campaign. And you can see the themes are interesting. Liberty, the be prepared, and the sword. I mean, I've been sure that Boy Scouts loved this when it came out. And it really sets up, I think, the organization for reaching over another step into being nationally recognized and being a part of American culture as it just becomes solidified in American culture. So I'm really glad you brought this in. thank you. I think this is really cool. And by the way, I'll reiterate again, no, we did not fund the war with the bond drives. It contributed, but it didn't make it all. So thank you much.
Well, thanks for clarifying
Yeah.
it. Other events available at the museum for 2021. Try the new escape room starting in the fall of 2021. Reserve a space by calling 651-748-2880. Sign up for campfire programs. June 10th features outdoor cooking. July 8th, jackknife skills. August 12th, s'mores and songs. Register at www.nssm.org. Come to learn about ham radio at a jamboree on the air. Watch the website www.nssm.org for dates. Reserve a time with the Derby Racetrack. Call 651-748-2880. Coming up, Mary Eva Johnson and her Golden Eaglet Award. Lorna Palm will present the 1925 award she won, and Sandy Craighead will explain the award and Mary Eva's story.
Hello, my name is Lorna Palm, and I'm on the board of the North Star Museum of Boy Scouting and Girl Scouting. And this museum has a golden eaglet pin that is dated from 1925.
That is a real treasure. Tell me more about it. Who did you get it from?
It was given to the museum by Barbara Boniface, who was a CEO for the Girl Scouts of St. Croix Valley in St. Paul in the 1980s. She received the pin as a gift from Mary Eva Johnson. Mary Eva earned the pin as an 18-year-old in 1925. I know that this is the highest award that a Girl Scout could earn at that time, but I don't know much more about it or about Mary Eva herself. Can you help me with the information about Mary Eva's golden eaglet and her story?
I'm glad you brought this wonderful item out for us to look at. I'm Sandy Craighead, and I've been associated with this council for my whole life, just as Mary Eva was. The Golden Eaglet was the top award earned by Girl Scouts between the years of 1919 and 1938. It involved achieving first-class rank, completing 21 merit badges, 14 of which were required, such as athlete, cook, dressmaker, laundress, and applying for and receiving a letter of commendation from the National Girl Scout headquarters. The letter of commendation was given to Girl Scouts who had given outstanding service to their home, church, and community. Mary Eva joined one of the first Girl Scout troops in St. Paul when she was 15, and 3 years later completed the requirements for the Golden Eaglet. Here's the newspaper article of her receiving her award. Mary Eva went on to be a camp counselor and served many roles as volunteer, and even was a paid staff member from 1929 to 1933 when she got married. Back in those days, women did not work after they got married.
That's really interesting, and that is a big change from today. Did you know her?
I did. Mary Eva was a delightful woman and a dedicated Girl Scout. I first met Mary Eva in the 1960s at Camp Lacamaga. She had been a camp counselor, camp director, and then again became a council staff member in the 60s. She served many roles there before becoming the executive director of the St. Paul Area Girl Scouts. Later, in the 1980s, she started her favorite volunteer project, which was to catalog and protect all the archives of the Girl Scout Council of St. Croix Valley, which is still an active project of Girl Scout of River Valley's council today.
I'll bet she had a lot of stories to tell.
She did. Mary Eva loved camping and taking her troop camping. Her favorite story was about a girl who said she wasn't an outdoor person, but she loved cooking. She didn't want to be left out of troop camping activities, so she found that she really liked outdoor cooking, and she was a happy camper when she discovered that. Once Mary Eva even found her rolling out a pie crust on a canoe. The museum has her golden eaglet pin, her uniform, and several newspaper articles about her in its collection, as you can see here. Here is her uniform that she wore in the 1920s. She continued to wear that uniform to council functions when she was an adult. Note how the badges are sewed on the sleeve of her uniform. She was the source of inspiration to many, and because she earned so many awards, she was named Council Treasurer of the Girl Scout Council of St. Croix Valley. The golden eaglet is a treasured collector's item, and the museum has a few. But Mary Eva's pin comes with 60 years of stories and Girl Scout experiences. Thank you, Lorna, for bringing this hidden treasure to our attention.
Thank you, Sandy. One of the things that we discovered when we were doing this research was found in this article about Mary Eva's Golden Eaglet Award. And there are a group of people listed who got also at the same time got a letter of commendation. And one of those people was Jean Randall. And doing a little research, we found that Jean Randall was Nancy Randall Dana's aunt. And she is pictured in our Founders Hall on the wall because it's named the Davis Randall Founders Hall. And each family is pictured over there, and Jean is prominent on that poster in our wall. And it turns out that Mary Eva and Jean Randall were lifelong close friends and went traveling and did all kinds of things together. If you want to know more about the Golden Eaglet Award, go to YouTube and search for Golden Eaglet, and you will find the documentary that was done by Julia Gordon-Low in 1919. It's very interesting and very much fun to watch, so I encourage you to look for more information.
Come to the museum for a tour or to hold an event. Reservations are required. Take a tour. Call 651-748-2880 for appointments. Hold a ceremony. Call early and make arrangements at 651-748-2880. Hold a meeting. Call to schedule 651-748-2880. The Charles Sumner Scrapbooks, presented by Kurt Likely, John Andrews telling the story of Charles Summers.
Hello, I'm Kurt Likely, the interim director of the North Star Museum of Scouting, and we found some interesting stuff in our collection. 2 books, 20 grand, and which is 20 years of Charles Summers being the Region 10 chair, and then the Paul Bunyan book over there, which was at his retirement a number of years later. And I thought it'd be interesting because really the books are hard to understand since they're letters thanking him and things like that, to bring in John Andrews to talk a little bit about the way Summers lives in scouting. So John, tell me some more about Summers.
Happy to. I was 3 years old when Charles Summers passed away, so what I would share is only things that others have shared. But everybody is pivotal in the scouting program, every single person, no matter what they do. It helps, however, to have some people who are very well known and have very large networks and can also help to pay bills. And that was one of the roles that Charles Summers played. It wasn't the only role. But Charles Summers was part of a company, and you can still find products around even though the company was basically wound down and wrapped up in the late 1940s. But it was George Summers and Company, and the branding is here on this handsaw, but they sold tens of thousands of different things. They were basically a wholesaler for country stores and general stores. And here's an example of a 1913 invoice, and it shows their huge headquarters downtown St. Paul near Mars Park. And then here's a warehouse also in St. Paul. This particular person ordered a nickel-plated music stand and a size 37 wool Mackinaw. And so this company did business all over the United States, one of the largest concerns, and that meant that Charles Summers traveled all over the United States which helped him in his role as a national board member, as well as our first regional president, as well as the person that Governor Eberhart called upon to help start scouting in 1911.
Well, I know, looking at Somers the little bit I've been able to, one of the stories that fascinated me was that he would go out bicycle riding, went down to Northfield to check on an order, and then rode back from St. Paul. So evidently he's fairly athletic.
Yes. Yeah, athletic and enjoyed the out of doors, and this was all pre-scouting, of course. You know, he was a young person in the company when he made that bike trip. But he did enjoy the outdoors very much, and this photo here is of the log building at Somers Canoe Base. And on that day when he and his wife drove through the gates of the Somers Canoe Base, he didn't even understand or realize that that day the base was to be named for him. But he had been at that point the regional chairman for quite some time, and for 20 years. And he had started bringing scouts to the Quetico and the Northern Tier in 1921 with his own son's troop.
One of the things that I really enjoyed in a letter that I found, well, actually it was in the Paul Bunyan history, it was quoted from it, that Somers told his friends, yeah, in 1919 at the national meeting, we thought we had to have something between the councils and national. So we got up on the tables and we shouted and we blew whistles and we got him to create regions. So how did Charlie then work out the region? Well, he obviously created it, so he would have been a pioneer in that.
Yep, he and Charles Deere Veely, who was the president of the Minneapolis Council, they were key, and they really believed from their experience with the retail industry, Charles Deere Veely with John Deere tractors and Charlie Somers with his company really believed in the idea of regional operations and breaking a national organization down into regional operations. And it was resisted by the national organization. It was seen as perhaps a watering down of their ownership as the franchisor. But yes, they forced it through, and I believe it made a huge difference, particularly for rural scouting. And so Frank Bean and Charles Somers, who were best of friends and basically created and ran the region for 20 years, they were very, very instrumental in creating scouting in small communities across Minnesota, the Dakotas, Iowa, basically the Region 10 territory. And it was a model that was used in other parts of the country. And the Minnesota State Fair. You know, we've got a great write-up about the role of scouting in the state fair since 1911, and that was a big vehicle also to help spread scouting through small communities across the state.
I remember that when they published, what was it, the 25th anniversary scouting history.
It was about those networks and those connections to act as advocates on behalf of young people for an organization that was still pretty darn new and still to be proven. Charlie Somers was a regent at the University of Minnesota throughout much of his time as the regional president. He was next door neighbors to Governor Eberhart on Crocus Hill. And when President Taft, the first honorary president of the Boy Scouts, sent telegrams to governors all over the country to try and get this scouting thing started, Eberhart turned to Somers. It was interesting, Taft came to visit October 25th of that year in 1911, and the St. Paul Scouts were included in the reception at Rice Park because Governor Eberhart made that happen, but the Minneapolis Scouts didn't come because there was a political difference between the two cities and who was in support of Taft and who wasn't. But his role as a university regent was probably key to the starting of the University of Scouting. And the University of Scouting, as we know it, was different in the early years. It was at Itasca State Park and in cooperation with the Forestry Department at the University of Minnesota. So Charlie's role as a regent doubtless helped. But the University of Minnesota was one of three key parties in Region 10 for years, the other two being the two metropolitan councils, Minneapolis and St. Paul. More evidence that Charles was more than just, a wealthy businessman with connections, however, was that he was the chairman of the National Jamboree Committee within Region 10. And so this is, of course, toward the end of his time, his 20 years as regional chairman, but he wanted to be directly involved. It's not known if he attended when that jamboree was eventually held, but he was the chair, and at the time of his death, he held the record for the most number of years on the St. Paul Area Council Board and the most number of years on the National Executive Board. So we have an interesting photo here, and this is at the University of Scouting about 1935 that the picture was taken, and it's unusual because Charles Summers is in uniform. As a business person, even with his program connections, he was rarely seen or photographed in a Scout uniform. He was usually in a coat and tie. He didn't work directly with a Scout troop when he first began. His son Davidson came along, a few years later, or was very young when Scouting started. And Charles, we talked about the war bond and, Davidson's role in that. But Charles was nearly 50. And so it's kind of cool to see a photograph of him in uniform. He is buried at Oakland Cemetery. And so this image of his grave at Oakland Cemetery is fun to visit, a person who was so key. It's interesting to track down some of the early founders of Scouting and where they live now, in their resting place. Charles became the namesake of the first service center ever built in Minnesota by a Boy Scout council, and he lies just about 30 yards from Rudolph Weyerhaeuser, who was the namesake of the Scout office right before the Somers Service Center.
One of the interesting things that becomes more intriguing now that we've talked some more about Somers, this book was his 20 years, his first 20 years, and it strikes me as being a little bit more professionally done. It's got this nice leather-bound piece. It's more professionally done. The leather binding, the title is sort of a Boy Scout piece. 20 grand years of scouting is the official title. It has proclamations from Minneapolis, St. Paul, the state government, those kinds of formalized tribute sorts of things you would expect. One of the things that has intrigued me as I went through it is the blue paper. That was the first thing that grabbed my eye as I looked at the book. And I thought, boy, that's interesting. And it's the official letterhead of Boy Scouts. And I discovered later on that there's a blue print, blue ink called Boy Scout Blue. And so that was a key, that was an intriguing nuance, for what it's worth. Now, I suspect Somers truly appreciated this book, without any question. Somers probably loved that book, because this is something that a Scout would create. And so, again, there are very few proclamations in here, even though he's retiring now, finally. But it's wood, the Paul Bunyan was the Region 10 icon logo, and it's titled Charlie down at the bottom. So this is a much more informal book in a lot of ways, yet you still have the blue paper, and so you've got things, and I'd have to really compare them, but I suspect there are more handwritten letters as a percentage in this one than there are in that one. And this one, they also, as we were looking earlier, they have a list of all the people who has a letter in here at the end. And it's a pretty significant chunk of people.
Yeah, some amazing names on that inventory of who contributed letters. And then, of course, if you add the two together, with some years between those two books, a lot of the founders of Scouting, nationwide, who've contributed letters, as well as very publicly known names of community leaders and business people. And Charlie was well known and loved by these people because of his personality. His buddy Frank Bean was the brains, and Charlie was the talker, as they self-described. And Frank Bean was also pretty wealthy, so he may have even contributed more to the financial success, but it was in partnership with Charlie, who was this warm, engaging, outgoing person who loved to tell stories, and who you couldn't necessarily rely upon for the facts of how it happened. People would say, well, Charlie may have compressed time a little bit when they would be asked to verify whether or not Charlie's accounting was accurate. but it was in the story and about the people. That was where he excelled, and they obviously loved him very much, which helped a lot of kids.
Thanks for coming in, and I've learned stories about Charlie I didn't hear, and truly a pioneer and a builder, no question about it.
Hear, hear.
Closing remarks by Dan Stoltz, CEO of Spire Credit Union.
Hello, everybody. I'm Dan Stoltz, President and CEO of Spire Credit Union. On behalf of Spire, we are so proud to support the North Star Museum of Boy Scouting and Girl Scouting. You know, I have enjoyed so much this virtual gala, and I've learned some really fun historical facts. The North Star is doing great work in the communities they serve in the upper Midwest through their events, youth, and adult programming and historical collections. Since the beginning, it was founded in 1976, they have collected over 150,000 artifacts, photographs, publications, films, and more to work towards their goal of preserving the history and significance of Boy Scouting and Girl Scouting. I'm a firm believer in giving back. You know, life is about giving, not getting. And I want to encourage all of you who are watching tonight to join me. You know, our generous support will allow the North Star Museum to continue working towards their mission of collecting, preserving, and sharing the important history of Boy Scouting and Girl Scouting in the upper Midwest. You know, to give back, visit the North Star Museum's website at www.nssm.org. I just want to say that one more time, www.nssm.org. From there, click on the image of the truck, and this will take you to the donation page. You know, Spire is so proud to be donating $1,000 to help work towards really their goal tonight of $20,000 for the Call to History program. I want to make this really clear that no donation is too little, and together we can be a part of the mission to preserve the history of the North Star Museum. Thank you in advance for being a participant in this event, in this great gala, and thank you for your generosity.
To make a donation to support the work of the North Star Museum, go to www.nssm.org and click on the old car to get to the donation page, or send a check to North Star Museum of Boy Scouting and Girl Scouting, 2640 East 7th Avenue, North St. Paul, Minnesota, 55109.
Okay. I wanted to bring in some rare mugs, but I was told they had plenty of mugs.
I have a nice old Boy Scout handbook from back when I was a kid, and I thought, what could be better for a museum but an old Scout handbook? But it turns out they have lots and lots of these, and they're focused more on things that are local to just this area.
I wanted to share this little tiny patch that I have from a Girl Scout event that took place in 1972. And I thought I would give it to the museum, but right now they're only accepting things that took place in their area.
Thank you to these three brave people who brought in their items that weren't accepted by the museum. And thank you all for coming, and I hope you enjoyed the show. Have a good evening.